Welcome to Off the Grid, a podcast for small business owners who want to leave social media without losing all their clients.
Let's go off the grid. Okay. Let's go off the grid. Okay. I know that you really want to put your phone away. Yeah. Let's go off the grid.
Hello, and welcome to Season 4 of Off the Grid. I'm Amelia Fruby. I am the founder of Softer Sounds Podcast Studio and the host of this show, where we talk about running creative businesses with radical generosity, energetic sovereignty, and no or minimal social media presence. If you're new to the show, thank you for being here. I am so honored that you've lent your attention to this episode and hopefully this whole season. And I want to make sure that you know about our free Leaving Social Media Toolkit. The toolkit includes a 5-step plan for leaving any social platform, my list of 100 ways to share your work off social media, and a super fun database, if a database can be super fun, for planning seasonal creative marketing experiments. Those tools pair with the first 4 episodes of the show, and it is all free. So again, if you're brand new, thanks for being here, and I'll invite you to scroll down to the show notes and grab that free toolkit. And if you're a returning listener, thank you so much for coming back for our 4th season. I finished last season with an episode on how to feel seen off social media, where I talked about the many ways and reasons that we go to social media to feel seen, and honestly, how it so often lets us down in that process. And today we're kicking off season 4 by continuing that conversation with an amazing guest who's here to help us unpack our ideas around visibility, bias, brands, social media, and so much more. So let me tell you about today's guest. Chloé Nwangwu, also known as the brand scientist, is a speaker, behavioral strategist, and brand visibility expert. A former international conflict mediator, she is now the founder of NobiWorks, a brand visibility consultancy where she partners with under-recognized brands, leveraging science to ensure they are impossible to ignore. Her clients have included a number of boutique firms, the High Ambition Coalition, and the first refugee delegation to the UN. Welcome, Chloé. I am so thrilled to have you on Off the Grid.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm honestly so honored to be here and also stoked.
As we should be for a good conversation, I think. I want to start with your title, the brand scientist. And I want to invite you to talk a little bit about what even is a brand, and maybe also like, what do brands have to do with visibility?
Yeah, this is a great question. And it's so rare that I actually get invited to unpack this. So thank you so much for this opportunity. So the first thing that I will say is that there's a reason that folks are a little unclear on what a brand is, right? And that's largely because there are as many definitions of what a brand is as there are people to give them, right? So I understand that I am, in giving you a definition, stepping into this tradition, and I apologize for that in advance. However, the definition that I run with is based on my background in behavioral, cognitive, and social science. And simply put, a brand is a system of ideas that influences the behavior of other people. Said another way, it's a kind of influential real estate in someone's head. Now, when I call myself the brand scientist, what this means is that I am studying both how ideas get locked into a human being's memory, right? And also what elements or characteristics make those ideas influential in the first place, right? So that's what it means to be a brand scientist. Now, to the question of what brands have to do with visibility. Great question. And this gets me into mechanically what's happening in the brain when a brand is sort of established there, right? So the way that this happens is a human being will take in some kind of stimulus, right? Whether or not it is something that they have read somewhere, something they've heard somewhere, something they have seen, a combination of all of these things and more, right? They'll take in some kind of stimulus. And that stimulus is very quickly assessed by the brain. And then the brain decides what to do with it. Now, if whatever is incoming, right, is something that seems useful or helpful or something that should be stored for later, then it has a high chance of making it past the brain's filters and being stored in long-term memory, right? Visibility is what's happening on the front side of those senses, that stimulus, right? Right? When something is taken in, it's because it was visible in the first place, right? And so in order to be influential in the first place, a brand needs to be visible. That's the bare minimum viable. A brand has to be visible in order to be taken in by, a person's various apparatus, and then to make it past the brain's filters, and then to be stored in long-term memory. The first step is visibility. So that's how those things are connected.
Wow. Okay. So much wisdom already. There's something I want to unpack here that I'm going to try to articulate. We are often told in business that visibility should be our end goal. The goal is to be visible. That's what we're working toward. But what I'm hearing you say is visibility is actually the baseline. It's the starting point. So could you talk a little bit more about maybe just unpacking some of what you already said about visibility toward what? Is it a mistake to only focus on visibility? Should we be thinking about visibility as a means to an end? Could you talk a little bit about where visibility kind of lives in all of this?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, you are correct, right? The visibility is sort of the first milestone, essentially, right? And so one might hear that and sort of say okay, well, if it's not the end goal, right, then why put so much focus on it? The reason is this, that visibility itself is so complicated and fraught that we need to focus on it in order for it to act in the way it needs to, for all of those other things we want to happen. And so a great example of this is even just the activity of getting past the brain's filters. Something being visible does not ensure that. There are tons of things that we see every day that we don't notice. And that's by design. Otherwise, we would be stuck in our beds when we wake up in the morning, staring at our palms and contemplating the universe, right? Which sounds like amazing use of time, actually, personally, but also we wouldn't be able to get anything else done, right? And so our brains and our bodies are very much trying to prevent that, right? So there's a bunch of stuff that's visible to us at any one given time. Not all of that stuff gets past the brain's filters. Not all of that stuff gets stored in long-term memory. Not all of that stuff gets stored in the right part of long-term memory. And the ways in which we can control for those elements is the ways in which we choose to be visible.
So I'm imagining listeners at this point, the feeling I'm having come up, I'll just speak from the I. So a feeling I'm having come up at this point is Chloé, how do I get past the brain's filters? What do you think are the most important things to focus on when we're first beginning to tend to visibility? Because you've said that it's fraught. So now that I know that, where do I begin?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I have so many possible answers for this question. So where to begin? I think that when folks are imagining tending to visibility, which is a lovely phrase, that's a lovely way to put that, they are imagining often raising their profile in some way, activities that they can use to raise their profile. Often I would say that if you're in this sort of beginning stage where getting past the brain's filter is the concern for you at this point, raising your profile is not even like, put that aside for now. The thing that I suggest folks focus on is your platform. And when I'm talking about your platform, I tend to break that down into two things. It's your premise, essentially, right? Your belief about the ways in which the world around you should be different, essentially. And then your positioning, the ways in which your premise is distinct. And you'll note that I say distinct rather than differentiated here. Ooh, this could be a whole podcast episode where, oh my goodness, differentiation is not necessarily something that is going to help a brand, a premise, or and anything get past the brain's filters, right? Distinction is. And that's why I say distinction, because that's something that research has demonstrated is likely to get past the brain's filters. Now, the difference between distinction and differentiation, I feel like I have so many resources on this that I can share some at some point, but very quickly, the difference is this, right? When something is differentiated, it is relative. It's differentiated from its peers. Now, the problem with that is an assumption of what the viewer considers to be your peers, right? Like, you as the expert in your industry, you will be trying to differentiate from other providers who are similar to you or who are offering similar things. But you don't know for certain that that is who your protagonists, the folks who are looking at you don't know that that's who they are considering in line with you. And so that differentiation serves no real purpose, or can end up serving no real purpose. Distinction, on the other hand, is something that takes into consideration what your protagonists are experiencing, what they are motivated by, their motivational drivers, their environment, right? It takes all of those things into consideration and says, aha, what is the thing that's actually going to gain and maintain their attention? What's the facet of your work that's going to do that? And so when you're beginning to tend to visibility, that's why I say that first, before you consider trying to raise your profile and do things like that, tend to your platform, tend to your premise and its positioning. That's where I start, because like I said, the very first barrier to entry as far as this journey is concerned is the brain's filters. And that has to be something that you are fluent in getting past before you can even consider the other arenas that are before you.
Thank you so much for that. And what it's bringing up for me is just one of the many ways that social media kind of does us wrong in this, because it convinces us that tending to our platform or growing our platform is about getting more followers. And it conflates what you're saying. It conflates cultivating a platform with raising your profile with growing an audience. Like on social media, all of those are the same thing. And that is a disservice to our work as brilliant creative people, because in addition to that, so often, people say this to me all the time, like there's no nuance on social media. And I'm not sure if that's always true, but I do think that there is a certain flattening there, which really takes our premise and positioning right out of what we have to say. And I think through the memification of these platforms, Instagram, TikTok, X, whatever it may be, also we're funneled into these pre-existing aesthetics or pre-existing formats of a meme or a sound. And that just strips your positioning out of there entirely. Maybe you can get your premise in a little bit, but the what makes it distinct is gone because it's just a meme now. And I mean, love a good meme. I'm not here to say people shouldn't. But if you are trying to be more visible or raise your profile, I don't know that that's going to work for you, right? What makes a meme feel good is that it's variations on a theme. And if we think about it, nobody knows who started a meme. We don't know those people. And that is the whole point of visibility, is so we know who you are. And if I'm learning from you correctly, that's like really where we get stored in the brain. Like it's getting your premise and positioning past the brain's filters so that this other person remembers what you've said and that you said it.
Exactly.
Is that correct?
Yes, that's exactly correct. Pitch perfect. And that's because when that person is then sitting down to make decisions that have something to do with your brand or that system of ideas that you have now planted in their long-term memory, if you're planted in the right place, right, and you're associated with the right things, you are likely to end up in that short list of candidates that they're considering. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do. Social media, though? Oh, oh, I have so many things. I have so many things to say about the ways in which social media, like you said, and I love the way that you put it, flattens positioning because it is flattening distinction and actually focuses or attempts to focus on differentiation, right? Like the slight differentiation from the original, right? Like essentially the slight variations and slight differentiations from that, right? Like it tries to focus on that. And the reason that it does that is because all social media is interested in doing is in farming and selling attention. That's all it's interested in doing. It's not interested in the process of visibility, which is gaining, maintaining, and translating attention and helping you do that. You are not social media's client or customer. You are their product. And so what they are trying to do is they are trying to farm the attention of others, sell that attention to large companies who can pay millions and billions for it, and then leave it to those companies to figure out how they are going to take that attention that they have gained, maintain it, and translate it, right? It's a very cushy, very easy business model for them, but it doesn't do us any favors. And that's not even bringing into it all of the cognitive biases and stuff that come into play when we're talking about that.
I'd love to go into that piece next, maybe stepping back specifically from social media, but I know that this is a huge part of your work is surfacing our cognitive biases and attending to the mechanisms of not only visibility, but recognition. And you've written a fantastic Harvard Business Review piece on under recognition rather than under representation. And so I'm curious, could you maybe take us in through that lens? Like, what's the difference between representation and recognition, and how does that then connect to visibility?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I would say is that representation is essentially the status quo of who gets seen. That's what representation is. And yes, in an equitable world, the status quo of who gets seen would be equitable, right? And that's why we're trying to like shift the window of like who typically gets seen. But the issue with representation is that it often will many things and read that article to see the many things. But a couple of the things is that one, it often puts the burden on the person who is underrepresented to be represented in the first place, right? It sort of says, oh, well, it just so happens to be the case that folks like you tend not to be represented. So do something about it, right? That's the sort of overarching premise of representation or underrepresentation, right? And it fails to acknowledge the fact that this isn't a passive scenario that just happens to be. It is a behavior. It is caused by behaviors, by active behaviors that people, individuals, groups, and systems participate in, right? And so that's why I like the word recognition or under recognition better, because it immediately points to the fact that we are talking about behaviors. It immediately points to the fact that this is something that's happening with individuals, right? Like a person is choosing not to recognize someone. Groups are choosing not to recognize other people. Systems are choosing not to recognize folks, right? But then it also allows us to detail some of the ways in which this is both overt and covert, which are some of the things that we do like about representation. So when I talk about under recognition, right, what I am discussing is a phenomenon wherein certain kinds of people are overlooked and have their contributions underappreciated as the status quo. And oh boy, what this means for visibility. What this means for visibility is that there are those of us who it's like we have an invisibility cloak on. And so no matter what right moves we are making, no matter how avidly we are participating in social media or whatever other tactics and strategies are presented to us, right? Like you're still doing that from underneath an invisibility cloak. And that invisibility cloak is maintained by cognitive biases that are largely unconscious. And so that means that people have to put great effort into removing that invisibility cloak from an underrecognized person in order for the recognition process to be equitable. So that's the difference between those two things. And that's where it comes into play as far as visibility is concerned. So if you've ever felt like you've been screaming or dancing, I guess, with TikTok into a void from whence there's no escape, and these are the actual words of a client that I've had, right? Yeah, you're not imagining that. You're probably underrecognized.
Just to maybe be explicit on this show, so many of our off the grid lovely listeners, you person with this in your ears right now, right? We're talking to women, we're talking to queer folks, we're talking to people of color, we're talking to also just people doing business in ways that are always dismissed and rejected by our mainstream business society. Like, talk to me as somebody who joined my local chamber of commerce, and LOL, what an experience that was. Right? Even just on a straight up like business model level of everyone being like, you do what? You make money? This is real? Let alone, identity markers of being a woman, being queer, all of these things. So I think that everyone listening most likely has encountered this in some way, whether we have allowed ourselves to feel it or not, because I just want to name that I feel like my instinct is always to internalize it as my own lack, my own failing. If I had just tried harder, kept going longer, added on another platform, built in another strategy, then I could have fixed it. And I appreciate the way that your work really brings to the fore that these biases exist and they are embedded in our culture, but they don't have to be embedded in ourselves. And so I'm curious if you'd like to talk a little bit more about the invisibility tax and like ways that it appears and shows up, or if you want to go more immediately toward like, what do we do? Like once we recognize this and once we kind of root it out of ourselves, the answer obviously to me is not just like, okay, we'll just be okay being invisible forever. Like, I'm like, ta-da! We can have our moment of wallowing about it. Like, I'm here for that. Like, recognize it, feel it. We have to like do that. But maybe we go there next. But I'm curious. So like, once we've sat with that and realized it, where do we go next? Like, because I know that your work is still about visibility. So you didn't point all of this out and then say, all right, let's reject visibility altogether. you're developing other tactics for us to become visible, to get past the brain's filters, to be memorable. So where do we go from here? Once we recognize these visibility biases, we've understood where we've experienced them. What comes next for us?
Yeah. So a couple of things. And I want to sort of like tease on something that you said to bridge the gap here. And it's the first thing is to realize that visibility biases, which are the cause of under-recognition, right? And the invisibility tax, which is what it feels like to be an under-recognized person, right? The extra bit of time, energy, money, resources really that you pay in order to be visible at all or to be as visible as your peers, right? These things are not personal failings. They are systemic ones, as you said. And the fact that the general reaction by under-recognized folks is to internalize it, as you said, and say, you know what? I could have grinded more. I could have pushed further. I'm not consistent enough. I'm not blah, blah, blah enough, right? That is also by design, right? That's also by design. And that's because the status quo is hardwired to defend itself within individuals, within groups, and so on and so forth. And I want us to be aware that under recognition is the status quo. And so that sort of defending itself, like under recognition defending itself, is not just something that happens in those who are adequately or over recognized, right? Who choose not to see that under recognition is happening or to deny that reality. It's also happening in those who are under recognized. Again, by design. Otherwise, under recognition would not be as sticky as it is, right? So an awareness that that sort of thinking is insidiously shaping your instincts about how you might approach under recognition, I think is probably the first thing. The second thing in terms of like concretely what we do, right? There's a lot, but what I will say is often I have folks, once their sort of like platform is, where it needs to be, often the next thing I have folks do is to start thinking about establishing what I call their circle of recognition, right? And I got this term from Angela Bassett during her Oscar acceptance speech. So shout out Angela Bassett. But a circle of recognition is just fancy word for your network, right? Like it is your network, but it's your network structured around a specific behavior, namely recognition, right? And so the way that you establish a circle of recognition and then tend to it and expand it as needed, right, is first you identify the stakeholders, and I say stakeholders plural, that are going to be required for your success. Because again, as we said at the start of this, visibility is largely a means to an end. You are trying to be visible to accomplish something. Sometimes you're trying to get into the rooms where it happens. I'm going to quote Hamilton, right? Sometimes you are looking to shape conversations in your industry about something or shift social dynamics, whatever it happens to be. There's going to be a palette of stakeholders that you're going to need to have strategically designed into your circle of recognition to make that possible. And often this is going to look different depending on where it is you're trying to end up or what it is you're trying to accomplish. But the 5 most common stakeholder types, I would say, are these. There are your protagonists, right? And I mentioned them earlier before, sort of in context. Your protagonists are the folks who are making decisions, right? So you, dear small business owner that is listening right now, these are probably your customers or your clients, right? But they may not be. So your protagonists. Then we have your champions, right? And champions are folks who've worked with you before and they're ready to sing your praises, right? So, and I'm sure that folks are pretty familiar with these 2 kinds of stakeholders. When we get to the third kind of stakeholder, this is where there's an unlock. This is where lots of common knowledge and common wisdom around visibility and brand and marketing and advertising and all of these things sort of overlook? Gatekeepers. These are the folks who are standing between you and opportunities that would help you get to where you're trying to go. They're not necessarily your adversaries, right? But they are the person who's standing between you and an opportunity. This person might be an editor at a publication. They might be, Amelia, you are a gatekeeper, right? They might be this person's assistant or what have you, right? But gatekeepers are necessary, especially if you are an under-recognized person, for ensuring that your circle of recognition is set up to amplify your ideas and your work in the right kinds of ways. Fourth, I would say are mediators, and these are folks who are directly connecting you to opportunities. Sometimes a gatekeeper can be a mediator and a mediator can be a gatekeeper, but they're not always the same, right? And then finally, we have advocates, right? And these are folks who are speaking about you and your work in places that you don't happen to be in yet. You need at least all 5 of these in your circle of recognition. And goodness, it's also why when folks are like, just know your persona, right? Like, do your ideal client avatar. I'm just like screaming. Because it's so misleading. It's so misleading. And it is not a network structure that can survive under recognition. And I think that's probably the boldest that I've said that before, but I really do mean this, right? That when you look at the geometry of human relationships and you look at what is required for behavior change to spread across human relationships, right? That weak tie essentially between you and like that ideal client avatar is not on its own strong enough to survive fixing under recognition. It's not. The tie is too weak. Under recognition is a complex behavior change. And that kind of thing can't survive that kind of relationship. But having these minimum 5 kinds of stakeholders that you know, as well as you do that ideal client avatar, hopefully in more helpful ways than you know an ideal client avatar, right? But having these 5 reinforces those ties in a way that allows recognition of under-recognized folks to transfer. And so I would say that that is the very next step. As soon as your platform is sort of like in getting past the brain's filters shape and getting stored in long-term memory shape, as soon as you're like in that shape, that's the very next thing that I suggest. Making sure we understand who these 5, and again, it might be different for you, but these are the most general, right? These 5 stakeholders are as far as what you're trying to get done is, right? What motivates them, the motivational drivers that generate those motivations, what makes them tick, understanding that for all 5 of these, and then making sure that they are strategically included in your circle of recognition. That's the very next step.
I mean, that is like a whole career's worth of work, but also so obviously why everyone calls you the brand scientist. Because what I love about what you just did is you took so much advice that I have both given and received around cultivating community in your business, and you really outlined much more specifically, like, what are these archetypes? What are these 5 types of people that we need in our circle of recognition? And when I reflect on it, I can see so clearly how I've benefited from that, but I could never articulate it as more than like being a good community member, which is valuable. I'm not saying it's not, but when somebody tells you to just like go meet people or make connections, so often what they're doing is pointing you toward your peers and your clients, and they're forgetting all of these other types that you're talking about. And I think that they're also not acknowledging power hierarchies that exist in relationships. And I think that that's so important and embedded in what you just said, right? You talked about gatekeepers, you talked about mediators. When we are growing a business or sharing our creative work, we are doing it within the power hierarchies of the society that we live in. And I love how you put this, like, if we want to combat under recognition or change the shape of those power hierarchies, we can't just like opt out of acknowledging them. We actually have to be engaging them and shifting them. And that does require, I think, an attunement to like, all right, this person has this type of power that I don't. I have this type of power this other person doesn't. How are we negotiating and navigating this together? And, as someone who has a podcast, like you said, like I'm in so many of these positions, right? Some people approach me and they're like, I want to be on your show, Amelia. You're the gatekeeper between me and this and sharing this message. And then there are other instances where I'm like, asking a guest to come on and like I feel like I'm coming from this place of like I'm a nobody and everybody like knows you and I wish you would just like and then even like us having this conversation, right, like was kind of a mediator advocate brought us together. Shout out to Pod, shout out to our mutual connections, shout out to Jessica Lackey, all these people who are like coming in so that I'm not just approaching you from this place of like, who are you? Which often when people pitch me, I'm like, who are you? I don't know. We don't have any mutual friends. What?
No, exactly this. And oh my goodness. And oh, I have so much to say about this. I have so much to say. Namely that, and I'm really glad that you teased out this element of power dynamics, right? Namely the fact that, again, under recognition is not malicious, necessarily. It is a default. That's all. It is an invisible script in our heads. It is learned brain chemistry. It is a shortcut so we're not expending so much energy making decisions. And that is why understanding the power dynamics that play around us can allow us to circumnavigate them or neutralize them when necessary, right? Lots of people ask me, like, why are you everywhere? How are you everywhere? Like, how did you end up in the Harvard Business Review? How did you show up? How did you do this? Part of me is just like, I just use my process on myself, right? But like, it's this circle of recognition. This is how you do it. And having a circle of recognition and understanding how to tend to it, how to leverage it when necessary, right? And like what leveraging it looks like in certain instances versus others, and how to grow it and expand it when you need to. These are things that are like gatekept, honestly. Gatekept with folks who aren't necessarily needing to deal with under recognition. And it's a shame because the folks who most desperately need that sort of intuition or that discernment are those who are underrecognized. It's your circle of recognition that's going to help you neutralize some of the elements of underrecognition.
I think that's such a good point that even the knowledge of needing a circle of recognition is gatekept knowledge, let alone how to cultivate one. And I think it even goes back to my share earlier. Something that I'm realizing I'm maybe unearthing in myself right now is that the way that I think I perhaps learned to make connections or do these things was actually in some ways a gift granted to me by my privilege, right? People just put me in the room. People just introduced me to other people. And I feel more aware of that now. And I actually feel more than ever that it's something I have to cultivate. I feel like, when I was a student, there was always this orientation of like people wanted to do me a favor. They wanted to help out. And then as I've gotten more established in my career, it's like, all right, now I got to help myself out. Now I got to like, okay. There's a little bit of that, I think, for me coming up. But as I'm reflecting on it right now, I'm realizing like, oh, the way I learned to do this is that people did it for me, which was a result for me of a lot of like educational privilege and white privilege. And what I'm just so grateful for you being on the show and you and your work in general is that you're sharing that knowledge for everyone, because a lot of people have never had that experience of somebody just offering them the hand up, putting them in the room. And that is, as you've said, a matter of under recognition. And it is something that we can do together. Hi, friends. Amelia here, interrupting this amazing conversation to tell you a little bit about Off the Grid's annual membership, The Interweb. The Interweb is your portal to launching, growing, and running a successful business without relying on social media. It's an annual membership for creatives, artists, small business owners, freelancers, influencers, entrepreneurs, and creators of all kinds who want support sharing their work and making some money without social media. When you join, you get access to on-demand courses taught by biz friends across the internet and monthly live events with me. The courses will teach you how to build foundational business skills and cultivate creative marketing practices. And the events offer real-time togetherness and guided support so you can feel less alone in your journey stepping back from social media, as well as have some answers to the question, where do I go from here? Lots of our members are still on social, but we're all committed to doing business in a way that doesn't rely on it to flourish and thrive. So whether you want to leave social media or not, the Interweb is your place to go for guidance and support growing a softer, more successful, more sustainable business that does not rely on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, LinkedIn, or Twitter/X to be profitable. If you're listening when this episode comes out, we are preparing for our fall retreat, which is where we will gather members to talk about our plans for the rest of this year, as well as have a few extra co-working sessions in September to actually follow through on those plans. And then there are some other great events coming up this fall, including an email marketing class that I'll be teaching, a creative manifestos class with a guest instructor, and a free coaching day with me, where 10 members will get free 30-minute coaching spots to talk about their unique creative business questions. That's just what's coming up in fall of 2024. So again, if you're listening when this episode comes out in early September, I want to invite you to join the Interweb before doors to the membership close on September 15th. And if you're listening in the future, welcome, my time traveling friend. I want to invite you to check out the link in the show notes to either join the waitlist for the Interweb, or if you're right on time, to come on in if we're currently inviting new members in right now. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode. I really hope that I'll get to see you in the Interweb, but for now, let's dive back into this amazing conversation. Just to recap what you've shared, it's like we have to have that baseline level of visibility, but also having to have a premise and positioning there, like having something to say, right? So in the sphere of Off the Grid, I get a lot of great emails from people who are like, I love the show. This is amazing. Thank you. Okay, you sent me that email. Now you're visible to me. And if I reply back and I say, this is so great. Your business website is awesome. Feel free to pitch me to come on as a guest anytime. I would say I do that a lot. And maybe like 1 out of every 3 people actually responds and gives me a pitch. And I'm just, I guess, trying to trace these sorts of steps of like, okay, we can make ourselves visible, but we also have to have the premise to share. And then we have to be willing to step through those doors and share it. And then from there, be cultivating that circle of recognition so that what we're sharing can continue to travel beyond, our own voice, even in some of these instances.
Yes, 1,000%. Mwah, chef's kiss, like perfection in a recap. I'm delighted. Yes, that's exactly right. And so that's why, as I think I mentioned before, I always have folks start with their platform, right? Because heaven forbid you get into a place where you're very visible, which by the way, chances are very low that you would get into that position without a platform, right? That is memorable enough to get past the brain's filters. But like, let's just say you did.
Let's just say that you're the hawk to a girl and it just happens for you.
Oh my God. Oh my God. Let's just say that's you, right? It is entirely possible to be visible and then have that translate into nothing. And so that's often why when I'm working with clients or when folks are talking to me about like, okay, where do I go next? What do I try? What do I do? Right? I'll tell them like, You have to be the obvious choice first before you consider making yourself an opportunity magnet. And folks usually want to do it the other way around because they want the opportunities to come. And I'm telling you, no, 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 no. Because you don't just want eyes on you. You don't just want to be visible. You want to be noticed, remembered, and then you want people to be influenced by that memory to act. There's a whole process.
Yes, I love that. You have to be the obvious choice before you become the opportunity magnet. What a brilliant piece of wisdom. And I feel like it just comes back to something I've said on this podcast with many guests, and many guests have said, which is that you have to know what you have to say and what you want from it in order for visibility to even benefit you. And most people I encounter, I would say, in life at large, don't know what they have to say and they don't know what they want. And I think many listeners of this show do know those things or they're on that journey. But that's the first step. And then from there, we tend to our visibility. We cultivate our circle of recognition. So before we wrap up, I want to spend a little more time talking about social media. How do you and your clients encounter social media? Because to me, it seems just rife with visibility biases. But what do you see there and how do you bring that into your work?
So what I'd say about this is it depends, right? I find that marketing, and I'm not a marketing expert, but what I would say is that I find that these things exist on a spectrum from traffic-based to relationship-based, right? And so I would say that if you are selling a product maybe, or your business relies on the sale of thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of things a month, then you're closer to the traffic side of things. And in that scenario, chances are pretty high that social media is something that you may need to consider, right? However, even in that place, we have to be aware of the fact that social media is essentially an instrument of representation, right? So it's an instrument of the status quo as far as who gets seen. And so that means that it reinforces visibility biases and it reinforces the invisibility tax, right? That means if it feels like when you compare yourself to peers who have maybe less privilege than you or more privilege than you, maybe I'll say, you compare yourself to peers who have more privilege than you, and you see that they are much further ahead as far as all of the things that social media tells you to find important, that's because you are paying an invisibility tax. And social media has been built with these biases in mind because it's not trying to change the ways in which people pay attention. It's trying to capitalize on the ways in which our attention is already allocated. So what that means is that if our attention is allocated in discriminatory ways, which it is, thank you, visibility biases, then social media is just going to reinforce those things, right? It is an automation, essentially, an algorithm that's reinforcing those things. And so you've got to be aware of that, even if you are on the traffic side of this equation, because while social media is a tool that you may find necessary for your work, you need to find ways to navigate using it that circumnavigates some of the worst of these visibility biases. On the other side, we have the relationship side of the equation. And this is where I find most folks who are running boutique firms tend to fall. And so this is like anywhere from 1 to 30, 40 clients a month or something like that. And in that scenario, like you don't need social media necessarily, right? Like you don't really need social media. Like you could use it if you want to. I don't know why you would want to, but you could. And in scenarios like that, I and my clients, I suggest they use social media as more of a logistical tool. And for example, when I use social media, it's largely to keep my circle of recognition aware of like what's going on in my universe, like just folks who are in my orbit, right? I'm not expecting social media to get me access to new people necessarily, right? And so this is where like I have an upcoming visibility clinic. This is where I share about it so that folks who are already in my orbit remember that that's coming, right? I have a new article out or, new research or something, right? Like this is where I keep folks aware, right? Like just remind them, just refresh their memory about me and what's going on, right? That's generally how I advise my clients to use social media when they are more on that relationship side of things.
I definitely agree with that sort of marketing spectrum. And I think I talk a lot about relationship marketing at Off the Grid. And so much of our like, you don't have to be on social media if you don't want to be premise comes out of that space of tending to small business, where even the bigger of the small businesses that I perhaps work with are maybe product based businesses fulfilling hundreds of orders a month, but not at that like tens of thousands level. So we're able to work on relational marketing strategies that may take up some of these tactics we're talking about, right? Like, I think there is a certain way where what you're describing is trying to do relationship marketing on social media or through our newsletter or whatever it may be. Whereas traffic marketing is so fueled at this stage by ad money to bring back in what we've talked about before, right? It's those companies paying these platforms for the attention. And I think that if I'm being honest, I have nothing to say about traffic marketing. I don't have any experience in it. But I think also that one of the key differentiators here that people don't talk about enough, or the distinctions between these two things, is I think it's also about pace. I think that you can grow a business using relationship marketing to have hundreds or thousands of clients or monthly orders, whatever it may be. It's just going to happen at a slower pace. You're going to grow it over time. And I think that traffic marketing is almost always an attempt to move fast. And it's that speed of capitalism. And if I wanted to make an even broader argument here, I think I would argue from my own intuitions, not from the science, because I am not the scientist. But I think that when we move really fast, those cognitive biases, the visibility biases, and all of them, they become invisible. Like we can't see them because we're moving so fast. But when we slow down, that's when we can start to notice what's happening and we can start to repair that status quo, as you've put it, to repair under recognition. Like we can't do that if we're moving so fast at the speed of virality and memes and pouring thousands and thousands of dollars into attention. Like it just doesn't work at that pace.
Can confirm the science supports that. That's all I'm going to say.
Oh, I'm glad. Well, Chloé, thank you so much for your time. I feel like I could absolutely talk to you about this for more hours, but in honor of everyone's attention, we will pause here. Could you just share with listeners where they can connect with you and the best way they can keep in touch or learn from you and your work?
So the first thing that I will say is you, dear listener, chances are after hearing this episode that you've questions. I often have that effect on people, to my great delight. And so if you have questions and you need them answered, I would suggest coming to one of my visibility clinics. I host them every month. They are always on a topic that's based off of what I'm hearing from people they need support around. These clinics are complimentary. I get reciprocity in other ways. And so essentially you are invited to come with your questions, come to learn about some of the cutting edge of brand science and these other things that I am working on. There are also bonuses and goodies too that you get. So if you have questions, join us for a visibility clinic and you can come to as many of those as you want. That's the first thing that I would say. The second thing I would say is if you want to sort of be in my orbit, right? You want to be made aware when like a new article comes out or something like that. You can find me on LinkedIn under my name. And that is generally where I am the most active. And that's largely it. I'm also on Instagram, but I'm on Instagram in the way that my Instagram is there and it's a repository of great knowledge and wisdom that you can go and read through. But largely, I'm just there in my stories sharing inspirational details about underrecognized folks and their successes. So if you would like that daily dose of positivity, join me on Instagram.
And NobiWorks also has a newsletter just for folks like me who are neither on LinkedIn nor Instagram and want to keep in touch. I'll just shout that out, and all of that will be linked in the show notes as well. Well, thank you again, Chloé, for this conversation. Thank you, listeners, for joining us in this episode and hopefully in all of our work around visibility and healing under recognition for all of us. And until next time, we will see you off the grid. Thanks for listening to Off the Grid. Don't forget to grab your free Leaving Social Media toolkit at offthegrid.fun/toolkit. This podcast is a Softer Sounds production. Our music is by Melissa Caitlin Carter of Making Audio Magic, and our logo is by Natelier Studio. I'm your host, Amelia Ruby, and until next time, I'll see you off the grid and on the interweb.
Let's go off the grid. Okay. Let's go off the grid. Okay. I know that you really want to